The photograph was taken at precisely 2:45 in the afternoon on November 3, 1912. The light had settled just right through the narrow east-facing window of the Werrick-Hale Estate's main hall, filtering down in long amber ribbons across the polished mahogany banister. Allan Milt, a young local photographer contracted by the county for property records, stood hunched behind his Gertz-Anschutz camera, adjusting the focus as his breath left ghostly puffs in the cool indoor air. He'd been instructed to capture standard angles, one from the doorway, one from the landing, and one looking down toward the base of the staircase. But what he captured that day would never be considered standard. The moment the lens shutter clicked open for the third frame, Milt noticed something strange through the viewfinder. The staircase, built in an elegant curve with 11 wide steps and a dark burgundy runner, seemed to fade, abruptly, at the base. Where he expected to find a tiled foyer, patterned in the estate's signature green and ochre ceramic, there was instead a patch of compact earth, darker than the rest, like a wound left unhealed. There was no subflooring, no baseboard edge, no indication of construction or renovation. Just the final step, suspended like an unfinished thought, hovering over untouched soil. He blinked, rubbed the lens, checked the tripod for slippage. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed. "That's not right," he muttered to himself, squinting again through the viewfinder. There was no time for further inspection. His driver, Mr. Trassel, was waiting outside, and the estate's caretaker, a silent man named Willard Cotter, was already tapping his pocket watch with growing impatience. Milt packed up his equipment, his hands unusually shaky, and scribbled a label for the glass plate. Stairwell, South Hall. 3 exposures. On the back of the second print he would later pencil, almost without thinking, Stairwell. Do not cross. At the time, no one questioned the image. Weeks later, when the prints were delivered to the Shaleford Hollow Council office, the clerk catalogued them under Easements, Internal Structure, misfiling the entire envelope into a cabinet reserved for property boundary disputes. It sat untouched for decades, its oddity reduced to a footnote. Those who viewed the photo casually assumed it was either a lighting failure or some flaw in the emulsion process. But it wasn't. In 1974, over 60 years after Milt pressed the shutter, a restoration team led by architect Julian Frey arrived at the Werrick-Hale Estate to begin preservation efforts. The house had been vacant since 1966, when its final occupant, a reclusive historian named Silas Vane, passed away under circumstances described only as ambiguous in the county file. The restoration began smoothly, with contractors noting the remarkable condition of the estate's woodwork and iron fixtures. But on the second day, one of the junior workers, Harrison Grigg, removed a section of the baseboard beneath the main stairwell in preparation for tile reinstallation. "What's underneath?" Frey asked, crouching beside him. Grigg turned pale. "It's just dirt, sir." "There's no floor, no supports, just packed earth." Frey frowned, reached for a flashlight, and leaned in. The beam revealed precisely what the 1912 photograph had captured: raw soil, untouched by tool or trowel. No joists, no mortar, no sign that anything had ever existed beneath that final step. "I don't understand," Frey murmured. "We've got blueprints, right?" "Original build plans?" But when the county sent over the 1897 documents, the plans ended abruptly at the 10th stair. No footer lines, no hatch marks, just a blank, featureless gap, as if even the paper refused to acknowledge what lay beneath. An inquiry followed. Architectural historians from both Vermont and Massachusetts arrived to examine the anomaly. They crawled beneath the risers, they measured, they scanned, they drilled samples, and each time they met with the same result: undisturbed loam, consistent with soil that had never been altered, not even during the estate's initial construction. "This kind of thing doesn't happen," said Professor Wilkins from the Boston Society of Historical Architecture, shaking his head at the core samples. A home this size, this pedigree, it would have had a solid foundation, a subfloor. You don't build a staircase to nowhere. And yet, Frey replied, staring at the gaping hollow beneath the stairwell, here we are. Word of the mystery never made it beyond a handful of preservation circles. The estate, though privately owned for decades, had never been open to the public, and local records remained scattered and sparse. The only enduring trace of the anomaly remained in Milt's original photograph, still catalogued under land easements, still bearing the graphite warning in his steady hand. Then, in 2008, the image was scanned by a graduate intern at the Shaleford Public Records Office, part of a digitization initiative led by the university's archival department. The scan, when analyzed under forensic software, revealed an even stranger detail. The soil beneath the bottom step had not only remained untouched, it was biologically sterile. The loam showed no trace of microbial life, no decaying roots, no fungal networks, no construction fill, no lime, no gravel, just dry, compact earth with no geological continuity to the rest of the estate, as if it had been placed there, a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. By then, Milt had long since passed away. His journal, if it had ever contained more details about that afternoon, was lost. But the photograph remained. Clear, uncompromised. The step still hovered, silently, as it had for nearly a century. And in the lower corner of the print, just above the darkness, the words remained unchanged. Stairwell. Do not cross. What you're about to hear suggests the staircase was not missing a floor. It was missing a destination. The scream came first, sharp, ragged, and too short to echo. It erupted from the lower hall of the Werrick-Hale Estate just past dusk, bouncing once off the stone pantry walls before silence reclaimed the air like a blanket. Leora Fex stood at the threshold of the servants' stairwell, her right foot lifted but frozen, suspended inches above the first mahogany step. Her hands trembled at her sides, knuckles white, the soft fabric of her uniform apron clinging to her damp palms. The gaslight above flickered slightly, though there was no draft, and in the stillness that followed her outcry the soft creak of timber beneath her hovered foot could be heard like a heartbeat too close to the ear. "Leora!" a voice called from down the corridor. It was Albert, the under-butler, his heavy boots scuffing against the parquet as he approached with a half-peeled apple in one hand. He squinted at her, then at the stair. "What are you doing there?" "It's just stairs, girl." But Leora didn't speak. Her chest rose and fell as though the air had grown thick. Her gaze was fixed, not at the step, but past it, or perhaps beneath it. Albert stepped closer, concern knitting into irritation. "You all right, or not?" He reached out. The moment his hand touched her shoulder, Leora jerked backward so violently she knocked the candle holder from the wall, sending it clattering to the stone floor with a metallic whine. I didn't fall," she whispered, her voice thin, confused. "It pulled." Albert frowned. "What pulled?" She stared at him, wide-eyed, breathing fast. "Under the stair," she said. "It pulled like it wanted me down." The incident was dismissed later that evening by Mr. Fenwick, the head steward, as hysteria brought on by overwork. "Too many ghost stories and too little sleep," he said, shaking his head. But Dr. Edmund Toller was summoned the next morning all the same. Toller arrived in his navy coat, his leather satchel glinting under a crisp sun. Leora sat on the edge of the pantry cot, her posture stiff, hands folded in her lap. Toller regarded her kindly, though his tone, as always, bore the weight of someone cataloging symptoms, not feelings. "She described a sensation of gravitational pull?" he asked Albert, scribbling notes in a slim, leather-bound book. "Did she fall?" "No," Albert replied. "That's the strange part." "She never touched the stair." Toller turned to Leora. "Can you tell me what you felt, in your own words?" Leora looked away. "It wasn't falling. It was down. But not here down. Like another down. like the floor was late or missing. Toller paused, pen hovering. Missing? She nodded faintly. And silent, but heavy, like a bell about to ring. The diagnosis was swift. Threshold hallucinations. He had seen it before, patients whose perception at thresholds, doorways, stairwells became unreliable. He prescribed a tincture of belladonna and rest. But later that evening, while the others dined upstairs, Leora slipped into the pantry and etched a message onto the back wall with a rusted nail. Below is not below. She left that night, never to return. Her replacement arrived a week later. Toller, however, continued documenting. He returned twice more over the winter, intrigued by a pattern. 2 more servants, both male, reported moments of vertigo or pause when approaching the same stair. One, the sculleryman Isaac, described feeling off balance without moving, as if space had wrinkled. Another, young porter Matthew, claimed the air near the stair buzzed like bees under glass. In his neuropathic ledger, found years later behind a bricked-up hearth in the Shelford Library, Dr. Toller compiled these and other strange phenomena. His terminology was stilted, limited by the language of his time. Threshold delirium, he called it, dissociative descent. In his notes, he drew diagrams, crude arcs, and gravity wells, trying to map what he could not explain. One sketch was dated January 3, 1913. Next to it, a short line. Patient hesitated on step 1. Reported second gravity, pulling from beneath floor. But the most chilling entry came not from Toller, but from a later find. In 1972, during a repair on the pantry flooring, a sealed envelope was discovered wedged beneath a loose floorboard. It was brittle with age, the ink faded. The county seal of Shalford Hollow was still intact. The label read, Police Memorandum, January 14, 1913, Foundling at Base. The pages inside were missing. Only the last line remained, torn cleanly in half and redacted with thick ink. But beneath it, in faint pencil, shaky, hurried, and crooked, was a scribble someone had added later. Wait without sound. They never found who wrote it. No records of a foundling from that date. No arrest, no police follow-up. Just the fragment, filed quietly and forgotten. Years later, during the estate's 1962 inspection, archivist James Lyle, reviewing old logs, would find Dr. Toller's journal with the same phrase echoed once more. Scribbled in the margin beside a servant's account of stair-induced vertigo, he had written, "How can something be heavy if it's not there?" That note was circled 3 times. Even then, the language failed to grasp what had already begun to unravel. At precisely 3:10 p.m., on February 14, 1913, the shutter clicked. Allan Milt held his breath as he removed the first exposed plate from the Gers Anschutz box camera, his fingers numb in the cold despite his leather gloves. The mahogany staircase in the main hall of the Werrick-Hale Estate loomed before him, 11 grand steps in a sweeping arc, polished to a dull sheen, bordered by carved newel posts and lined with a rich burgundy runner. Gas sconces hissed softly along the walls, casting flickering gold light over the old wood and catching the fine dust that danced through the still winter air. He set the second plate into place. Outside, snow blanketed the lawn, untouched and crystalline. Inside, the air was dry and still, the windows sealed tight to keep out the biting cold. Milt adjusted his tripod slightly and took another shot from the same angle, his lips pressed together in focus. He had captured countless homes like this, some grand, some falling into ruin, but there was something about Werrick-Hale that clung to him, like cold air in the lungs that wouldn't warm. He stepped forward. The third plate was meant to capture the fine detail of the lower stairs, the intricate carving along the balusters, the subtle warp in the 11th tread that he had noticed during setup. He moved slowly, camera under one arm, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of light. As he reset the angle and readied the final plate, a faint draft brushed past his left cheek. He paused. The house was supposed to be sealed. "Odd," he muttered, more to the silence than to himself. He pressed the shutter. At that exact moment, something shifted. Not a sound, not a creak, but a change, a pressure, a weight, like the floor had inhaled and held it. Milt blinked and looked up from the camera. His heart stuttered in his chest. The lowest step was no longer meeting the floor. It hovered, unsupported, above a patch of hard-packed earth. He staggered back, nearly knocking over the tripod. The burgundy runner no longer reached a tile floor because there was no tile floor. The wood just ended. Hanging in midair, clean, dry, and untouched by anything below. Dust floated from the void where floorboards should have been, settling gently into the dirt that had no right to be there. Milt's breath caught in his throat. He dropped to one knee, carefully pulling the camera aside. The dust was still falling. He watched a single mote drift down, as slow as a feather, and vanish into the soft, silent loam. He waited to hear it land. There was no sound. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this isn't. He turned sharply, searching for some trick of light, some broken timber, any reasonable explanation. But the staircase was unbroken. 10 steps sat perfectly intact above the 11th, which hung suspended over nothing. His pulse roared in his ears. In his leather notebook, he wrote hurriedly, "Step 11, swallowed the rest." I saw the dust fall. There was no sound. He left the house without packing the camera. He didn't even remove the final plate. It stayed in the camera, sealed in darkness, until he turned it over to the Shaleford Photographic Registry 2 days later, hands shaking, voice hushed, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. They developed all 3 glass plates. The first showed the staircase in its full grand sweep, 11 steps, intact. The second was nearly identical. But the third revealed the truth that haunted Milt's eyes. The final step hung above compacted soil, with no visible support, no platform, no foundation. A void. Inspectors were called in. They searched the estate. No tampering, no stagecraft, no trap door. And the soil beneath was dry, old, and firmly undisturbed. In 1949, the emulsions on the plate were tested. Again in 1991. Both times they came back clean. No sign of manipulation, no double exposure, no contamination. But in 2008, a new scan changed everything. Radiographic imaging revealed something faint, something unnoticed before. In the soil beneath the step, almost invisible, the soft outline of a shoe print. A man's size pointing toward the stair, pressed into loam that, by all earlier accounts, had never been touched. The footprint didn't belong to Milt. His boots were still catalogued with the Shaleford Historical Archive. The tread pattern didn't match. No workers had entered the house that day. The print was never explained. It simply appeared decades later, where none had ever walked. Allan Milt never spoke publicly of the photograph again. In 1915, 2 years after that day, he was admitted to Halbridge Sanitarium in western Vermont. Diagnosis: directional displacement delirium. He insisted he could no longer trust his own movement, said he'd once stepped into a hallway and emerged in a different corridor, that rooms rotated when he blinked, that north no longer meant anything at all. His final sketch, found in the back of his notebook, was a staircase in a spiral, drawn with trembling hands, ending not in a floor, but in an empty sky, and beneath it, scrawled in the same careful script. The camera captured only what it was allowed to perceive. Dr. Ivor Lestrange adjusted the final lens with trembling fingers, the lamplight above flickering against the brass casing of the Petrolux lens frame. He leaned forward, bringing the curved edge of the glass plate into focus. The room was silent except for the soft whir of the mechanical lens housing, a prototype built under his own specifications at the New Haven Museum of Optical Phenomena. The staircase on the glass plate emerged with stunning clarity: mahogany rail, gas sconces frozen mid-flicker, 11 steps descending into a stillness that made his throat tighten. But something was wrong. The lower edge of the final step, the 11th, refused to reflect. Where there should have been a return beam of light, even a faint echo of contour or grain, there was nothing, just an ambient shimmer, like light dissolving into fog. Lestrange frowned, adjusted the aperture ring, and watched again. Still no return. He slid back in his chair, sweat collecting beneath his collar. "This isn't possible," he whispered. His assistant, a young intern named Morrill, sat silently nearby, watching the doctor's expression shift from confusion to unease. Lestrange scribbled notes rapidly, the pen tapping against the edge of the paper as he wrote, "Polar asymmetry confirmed. No return reflection. Lower stair fails longitudinal scatter calibration." "What does that mean?" Morrill finally asked, voice low. "It means," Lestrange said, standing, "that the stair behaves like open air. Or, less than that, he didn't sleep that night." He reviewed the plate again at dawn, using a different calibration through a refractive index test. Same result. He rotated the plate 180 degrees. Still void. He placed a grain finder against the edge. No change. The stair wasn't just reflecting poorly, it wasn't reflecting at all. A week later, in a letter to the Institute for Structural Logic at Montverset Polytechnic, Lestrange sent the plate with a full report. It reached them mid-December 1924 and was shelved for over 3 decades until a group of graduate students reopened the file in 1957. The students had no idea what they were about to find. Using a new perspective grid overlay, they recalibrated the vanishing point of the photograph. The expectation was simple. The base of the staircase should terminate at the bottom of the frame, where the floor would be. But it didn't. "See this?" one student said, tapping the transparent overlay with a pencil. "The vanishing lines don't converge on the ground. They cut off just above it. The geometry ends before the structure does." Professor Harlan Sykes, a senior analyst with decades of experience in optical physics, reviewed the findings the next day and issued a single-sentence summary. "The vanishing point ends before the physical base, consistent with a depth recursion fold." A fold, as in space collapsing inward. But if the staircase folded into nothing, then why had the house remained intact? Why had the step been used for decades without incident? Why had no one fallen, no one vanished? Unless they had. Across the state line, retired Detective Harlan Trask had been following the staircase case since 1951, ever since he'd stumbled across an anonymous clipping referencing the 11th step of Shaleford Hollow. Trask had never seen the glass plate, but something about the wording had lingered. He knew of the Werrick-Hale Estate, had passed it once on a fishing trip years ago, and decided to search the county archive for blueprints. It took 6 months of dead ends and unfiled boxes, but in a mildew-scarred leather roll dated 1899, he found the architectural plans of the estate. There it was, the grand staircase, curving like a ribbon through the center hall. 10 steps, no 11th, no base, no floor. There was no sign of revision, no faded ink suggesting an addition. The blueprint was definitive and damning. Trask stared at the plan, lips drawn tight. "That last step don't go nowhere," he muttered, his voice a low rumble. "Wasn't ever supposed to." He mailed a copy of the plan to the Montverset Institute. When the envelope arrived, Sykes reportedly turned pale. 6 years later, in 1962, a young researcher named Ethan Rowe conducted a thermal scan of the estate's staircase room as part of an independent architecture survey. He entered the building with standard infrared gear and a notepad, expecting minor temperature variations due to the age of the insulation. Instead, he stood frozen on the landing, staring at the readout in disbelief. The air and the soil in the void area, where the final step hovered, were identical in temperature, 64 degrees Fahrenheit, no draft, no cooling effect from the ground, no heat radiating from the air, a flat line, an anomaly. Inside a sealed building, this was impossible. Soil retained heat differently than air, always. But here, there was no distinction. Rowe reset the scanner twice. No change. He stepped closer. The final step looked ordinary, mahogany worn to a polish, a faint scuff along the corner. But as he knelt beside it, placing his palm near the edge, he felt a chill that wasn't reflected in the device's readings. A stillness, a hum beneath silence. He stood and backed away, noting the result with a shaking hand. No temperature differential between air and soil, he wrote. Area behaves as null thermal zone. He didn't return the next day. The report was filed under unexplained reading and appended to the growing Werrick-Hale dossier, which now occupied 4 shelves at the Montverset archive. No one had yet offered an explanation, but no one had dismissed it either. And in the decades that followed, even as the estate grew more forgotten, even as the glass plate fogged slightly in its frame at the museum vault, the staircase remained, unchanged, waiting. No authority could explain the contradiction, but none dismissed it either. The compass spun without pause, slow, deliberate revolutions that ignored north as though direction itself had been erased. Dr. Naomi Maris crouched at the edge of the staircase, her breath held tight in her chest, eyes fixed on the antique brass needle that rotated above the worn mahogany of the 11th step. It made no sound, no vibration, just a ceaseless, mocking dance. She did not speak at first. Her assistant, Mark Fenner, waited a few feet behind, his hands tucked into the pockets of his trench coat, the cold of the unheated Werrick-Hale foyer creeping up his spine. Outside, wind beat against the estate's boarded windows like an impatient visitor. Inside, the silence held dominion. Naomi finally whispered, "It's not magnetic interference." The casing's shielded Mark stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Then what is it?" Her fingers slowly reached to lift the compass from the stair. The moment she did, the needle halted, dead still, pointing true north again. Naomi stared at it, her hand trembling slightly. A field. Localized, but not electromagnetic. Mark said nothing. He glanced down the staircase, noting again how the last step seemed to hang above a plane of soil with no visible support, casting no shadow below it, despite the overhead window's clear light. The air near it felt oddly muffled, like sound avoided it. Later that evening, seated in a dim corner of the Harpen faculty lounge, Naomi outlined the theory she had long hesitated to publish. "What if," she began, stirring untouched tea, "this step doesn't terminate in physical space?" "Not as we define it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting what? A spatial fold? Not just spatial? A breach, a deviation from the Euclidean model." Her voice lowered. "Bleed space." She saw the flicker of disbelief on his face, expected, deserved. But she pressed forward. "We measure space as an absolute, a container. But here we're seeing space behave like it's being overwritten. And we're only seeing the trace, the aftermath. In 1974, core samples from beneath the staircase were taken during the failed restoration led by Julian Frey. The soil retrieved was pristine, undisturbed loam, no tile fragments, no residual construction fill. Naomi had studied those samples herself, years later. No mineral disruption, no signs of human alteration. It was as if the house had simply stopped. 3 prevailing theories had surfaced since the anomalies were first revisited in the 1960s. Each tried and failed to explain the 11th step. The first, the structural theory, argued it was all a photographic trick, depth illusion caused by shadows, distortion, or lens warp. It claimed the floor existed, but was obscured by exposure anomalies. But photographic tests conducted under controlled light in 1991 had disproven this. And then there were the soil samples, again and again. No evidence of any floor beneath the hovering tread. The second theory, older and more conspiratorial, was the so-called cover-up theory. Proponents suggested the step had once led to an illegal basement wing, perhaps a makeshift burial chamber bricked up after some unreported tragedy. But ground-penetrating radar scans conducted in 1992 shattered that notion. There were no walls, no cavities, no buried anomalies. Only a slow, continuous slope of undisturbed earth descending from the base of the step, defying the typical foundation architecture of the time. But it was the third theory, the most radical, the most feared, that had begun to draw attention, especially among physicists and fringe topologists, the ontological breach hypothesis. Naomi had once called it academic suicide in a conference paper. Now, she was ready to defend it. Space doesn't always collapse. Sometimes it thins, she explained during a private faculty session, and sometimes, very rarely, it folds. A slide projector clicked behind her, displaying the original 1913 glass plate. She pointed to the base of the staircase. If this was simply a missing floor, we'd have found architectural evidence. If this was a hoax, it wouldn't have survived radiographic, thermal, and sonic analysis. But what if this is a threshold, where structural logic was not violated, but rewritten? The room was still. One of her critics, Professor Allan Milt, scoffed. "And what's the mechanism, Dr. Maris?" "Magic?" Naomi didn't blink. "No. Geometry back at the estate, the anomalies persisted. Instruments failed within 3 feet of the step. Batteries drained inexplicably. Once, during a quiet midnight observation, a portable seismograph set atop the wood began registering movement beneath the earth, despite no external activity, no wind, and no measurable vibration in the structure. Still, the question remained, why did no one report this for over 50 years? Why did residents continue to use the staircase, host guests, walk across that space without mentioning what was clearly missing? Mark had proposed it late one evening, almost ashamed to say it. What if it wasn't missing for them? Naomi had frozen at the suggestion. He continued carefully watching her. What if you're standing there, and your mind fills in what should be there? You step forward and see tile. You feel resistance. You walk, but the camera, she said slowly, the camera doesn't lie. Mark had looked at her, then at the photo. Maybe the camera sees something we don't. Or maybe the step decides what each of us sees. The idea took hold. They returned to the estate again in early spring. The wind had calmed. The boards remained in place. Naomi stood before the step once more. Her reflection in the glass pane above the stair was still. The compass, once again, spun gently in her hand. As she knelt to set it down, her breath caught in her throat. The air was colder here, sharply colder, even though no draft could be detected. The edge of the stair appeared to waver slightly, not visibly, but as though her sense of depth refused to align. She looked back at Mark. He hadn't moved. "Do you see anything?" she asked, her voice low. His answer came slowly. "I'm not sure." She stepped back, hesitating only a moment before whispering the thought neither of them wanted to say aloud. "Because if you were standing there, maybe you saw something different." At exactly 3:17 a.m. on March 2nd, 1974, Peter Dahl's voice came through the two-way radio like gravel dragged across glass. "It's opening wider," he said, breath short. "Under the step, it's widening." Static followed. Then silence. Julian Frey had been sleeping on a fold-out cot in the East Wing office, wrapped in his coat and blanket against the cold that had seeped through the estate despite the restoration heaters. The call jolted him upright. He didn't waste time dressing. He grabbed his boots, stuffed his feet in them without socks, and threw a flashlight into his satchel. His breath fogged as he moved through the darkened corridors, past walls stripped to lath and dust-covered drapes. Each echo of his footsteps bounced back as if the house had grown larger overnight. By the time he reached the main hall, the temperature had dropped further. He could see it, faint mist clinging to the banister rail, the kind that belonged outside on an early November morning, not indoors. The thermometer nailed to the entry frame read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. That was 20 degrees colder than any other part of the house. "Peter," Frey called, his voice low but firm. "Where are you?" The night watchman stood near the base of the stairs, lantern dangling in his right hand. He didn't turn immediately. "There was a sound," Peter murmured, "like a breath, but backward, like something inhaled." Julian stepped closer. The floorboards underfoot creaked, not in protest, but as if bending towards something. His flashlight beam flicked across the steps. The 11th stair, the final one, was no longer hovering 2 inches above the earth. It was now nearly 4. The soil below it, once flat and dense, had settled further, sloping downward into what appeared to be a narrowing funnel of blackness. "Did you move anything?" Julian asked, crouching. His breath steamed around his face. Peter shook his head slowly. "Didn't touch it. Just came by for a routine check. Then I heard the sound. Then." He lifted the lantern. "I got closer. The ground looked like it was shifting." Before Julian could respond, the lantern slipped from Peter's grip. It tumbled silently into the darkness beneath the step. No crash, no scrape, not even the sound of glass breaking. Julian turned sharply to Peter, whose face had gone pale. "Did it hit something?" Peter's voice trembled. "It didn't hit anything. It's like it didn't land at all." Julian approached the stairwell, heart pounding. He knelt beside the 11th step and extended his flashlight downward. The beam hit nothing. It stopped short, like the darkness was swallowing light itself. He tossed a pebble into the gap. Nothing. No thud, no bounce, not even the flutter of displaced dust. He stood, gripping the banister. A tremor rippled through the wood, subtle but undeniable, like something shifting far below. The banister felt warm on one side, cold on the other. Julian stepped back. "We're sealing it," he said. Peter nodded, still unmoving, as if whatever he had heard, or hadn't heard, had cracked something in his thoughts. The next morning, the county inspector arrived, summoned by Julian before dawn. Once measurements were taken, temperatures logged, and photographs snapped, the verdict came swiftly. The house was to be sealed indefinitely. No public access. No further restoration. No exceptions. But it wasn't just the stairwell. Something else had changed. Julian returned to his workroom that afternoon and opened the photograph, the original glass plate from 1912. It had always been kept under climate-controlled conditions in a locked portfolio case. But now, the surface showed faint internal fogging, not on the outside but within the plate itself, as if the emulsion was reacting to something invisible. Then came the file. In 1998, a digital archivist scanning museum records noticed a strange metadata entry on the scanned photograph file. For exactly 12 seconds, the file name changed on its own. Logged at 3:17 a.m., the exact minute Peter Dahl had made his call 24 years earlier. The name read stair_0001.root, and then it changed back. No edits were found. No traces of manual access. Just the brief anomaly, logged and archived by a system that didn't question the nature of names. Today, the original glass plate remains locked in a temperature-controlled case inside the Harpen Museum of Anomalous Records. Visitors are not permitted to touch it. Cameras are not allowed near it. On colder days, staff report condensation forming inside the sealed frame, beating along the lower edge, right beneath the image of the final stair. Some believe it's a flaw in the glass. Others insist it's the past pressing against the boundary of observation, but those who've seen it say otherwise. Would you step down a stair that leads somewhere the world forgot to build? Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.